So, we're going to do something a little bit different today. This is going to be sort of a podcast episode on my channel rather than a traditional gameplay channel. And if you think this is just going to be, an hour of me talking about grief, that's not really going to be the case. I think Legacy is broken, and I think fixing it might require more than just grief. And so I'm going to talk about the metagame, what I think kind of happens if grief gets banned, and we're going to really kind of deep dive and go into some theory. I'm recording this on July 19th, which is a Friday. It will release the following Friday. If for some reason we get an emergency ban on something in this next week, then this will be a sort of historical, this is what my thoughts were before that ban happened. But if that emergency ban hasn't happened by now, after they realized hold on, can I swear yet? Am I 30 seconds into the video? I can swear yet. When they realized that they fucked up, cool. So yeah, let me just get a couple of things out of the way at the beginning here so I don't have to kind of interrupt my sort of stream of thought consciousness video here. Folks, all my deck lists are available on moxfield.com. If you check out my profile, everything, including some of the things that haven't been released on the channel, will be up there, including my EDH decks if you just want to thumb through and see what those are like. And if you need cards, please consider checking out toamagic.com and using promo code ThrabenU to save 5% on your order when you do so. You always get free shipping through them, and I'm going to be ordering a whole bunch of Commander cards when Bloomburrow comes out. With that being said, let's do the little da-da-da-da-da thing and get right into it. Hello folks, Phil Gallagher, aka ThrabenU here for another Legacy video. And today I want to talk about the Legacy format. And I want to try to approach this in as empirical a way as possible to start with. A good portion of today is going to be my own opinions, but I think factually speaking, the format is very broken, and we're seeing some of the most warped numbers that we have ever seen in Legacy. No hyperbole there. I want to show this off in a couple of different ways, just as a starting point here. So this is MTG Goldfish, and according to MTG Goldfish, Reanimator, the blue-black deck that we've all come to know and love, is about 32% of the metagame. Before you go, that can't be right, I want to show a couple other places that show off the same thing. So here we are over at MTG Top 8 now, where if we scroll down to the combo section, we have 25% of the format listed as Reanimator. Again, a little bit of a difference, but not a striking amount. And some of the things that are in this Dimir aggro category are probably really the same sort of deck, minus a couple of cards as well. And depending on how you filter your data and when exactly you check your data, you can see numbers as warped as what you are seeing here. This was an actual factual MTG Goldfish screenshot from last week, where blue-black Reanimator was showing up as literally half of the format in the last 7 days worth of events. So, establishing our baseline here, blue-black Reanimator is an unhealthy portion of the metagame with the win rate to back it up. And if you are kind of interested in what that win rate looks like at any given time, please consider checking out the Legacy Data Collection project. They do a pretty good job of tracking that to the best of our abilities, given our limitations with data gathering on Magic Online. So, public enemy number one right now in the mindset of most Legacy players is grief. It is enabling the Grief Reanimate scam starts that generate incredibly poor gameplay patterns while also giving these blue-black decks an incredible way to protect their combo finish. When you can have like Grief and Daze and Force of Will and maybe more protection beyond that if you want, as free interaction to protect turn 2 Reanimate a giant creature, that's pretty strong. And This was the best thing to do in the metagame prior to Modern Horizons 3. People had been trying to adapt to the Grief Reanimate Blue Black Reanimator shell, and generally speaking, they had failed to do so. It was the best deck in the metagame. I'm not going to cite exact statistics, but it had a kind of borderline bannable win percentage at the time, while also just kind of being miserable to play against because you can keep a hand that has two incredibly good cards in it, and then Grief Reanimate comes along and you just don't play Magic that game anymore. So in addition to just being objectively powerful, it was just also unfun play patterns. And then Modern Horizons came along and they printed what feels like a literally perfect card for the deck, Psychic Frog. This was something that I had initially glossed over in spoiler season. Like, I knew that it existed. I knew some people were hyping it up. I didn't think that this card was particularly good until I started playing against it. These sorts of deal combat damage to a player, draw a card effect, like they haven't been super good in Legacy really for the entire time that I've been playing Legacy. But this one is different. So most of these you deal combat damage to a player, draw a card effects don't come with any sort of built-in evasion. And Psychic Frog has flying, which in Legacy, it's not literally unblockable, but it's pretty close. There are flying creatures, but most of the time, if you can fly through, you ignore the vast majority of blockers. The Psychic Frog also allows you to discard cards, which fuels your Reanimator plan, and if your opponent is doing something that shuts off some of your cards, let's say something like a Vexing Bauble, oh, now your Dazes, your Force of Wills, your Griefs are all worse, they just turn into Psychic Frog food, and your hate card doesn't actually accomplish anything. You know what your hate cards are supposed to do? Accomplish something. And this has been one of the biggest problems with this blue-black Reanimator deck, just generally speaking. Grief is very good at dealing with most graveyard-based hate. You have a surgical or a fairy? Well, guess what? The Grief just takes that on the way down. You start the game with a Leyline of the Void? Okay, cool. The Grief is just a hard castable later on. Or if your opponent has something unfair that they can do, maybe they can just, use Grief to force that through anyway. And so Psychic Frog's middle ability here to junk those bad cards and turn them into a spell that essentially says, discard this card, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. Honestly, not bad. But Psychic Frog did a lot of more subtle things for the blue-black deck than just that. The Force of Will counts weren't that good for this deck. And so in talking to combo players, sometimes they would say, yeah, their blue count sucks. I'm just going to try to jam on turn 1 if I'm on the play. And that was like a valid strategy. Well, Psychic Frog is pitchable to both Grief and Force of Will as a starting point in addition to all of the other things that it does. And previously, one of the things that you could do to beat these blue-black Riskaminator decks was just play a large creature. They were relatively light on removal, so if you stuck a powerful creature, there was a good chance that you could just ride combat damage to the end of the game. Well, guess what? Psychic Frog just wins combat. It is very difficult to profitably attack into this creature, as your opponent decides whether or not they are doing these whole like +1/+1 counter things. So if you have a reasonable sized creature, and let's use a Thought-Knots here as an example here. So you have a reasonable sized creature, and your opponent plays a Psychic Frog. Your 4/4 creature that you spent 4 mana on now can no longer attack into that Psychic Frog. Your opponent can discard 3 cards to grow Psychic Frog outside of range of Thought-Knots here, effectively block. When they do block and win combat, you draw a card. So you pass the turn. Your opponent can then make Psychic Frog fly, draw a card, play a new Psychic Frog and put you back into that exact same situation, or play a Murktide Regent and spin combat. Or, since you're not attacking, oh, I can just use this time to cantrip, look for my Reanimator finish, and you still can't attack into my Psychic Frog. So you see the general problem here? The best deck in the format that people were already having trouble attacking now gained something that smoothed out its draws, addressed a lot of its weaknesses, and fixed counts for things like Force of Will and Grief all in one card. So it has this giant portion of the metagame because the deck is incredibly difficult to attack even when it is public enemy number 1. And while I am frustrated that Grief did not receive a ban when the legacy specialist inside Wizards of the Coast said you should ban Grief, what I'm most frustrated about is that all the data and playtesting that is going on with Modern Horizons 3 right now is basically fucking meaningless. Because come August 26th, I think it is, when Grief will get banned, I think that is just objectively a fact, we are going to enter the format that we should have entered a month ago, and we could have been using this time to gather data about which cards are and are not actually good in the current legacy format. But the current legacy format is so warped right now and so sick right now that very few things are really viable. And important questions that need to be answered are not getting answered right now. So, for example, here is a question. Is Psychic Frog too good of a card for Legacy? I have no fucking idea, and I have no ability to test that right now, because some of these Psychic Frog decks are being propped up by the Grief Reanimate shell. And so, is the blue-black core going to be acceptable without Grief around? My podcast co-host, Brian, said, yeah. Taking out Grief really makes the beginning of the game worse for those decks and takes away an important angle to cheese wins with. And I have been bullied by Psychic Frog a whole bunch on this channel recently, and I'm a little worried about this card. But instead of Grief just being banned a month ago, and we get to use this time before the release of new cards to test and see hey, is this card actually too good for the format? Or does this card only look as good as it does because of the existing blue-black Riscaminator shell? And I get to gather no data on that point. And you know what is going to happen at the end of August is we're going to get rid of Grief. We're probably not going to touch the remainder of the format, as we're going to be right around the release of a new set, and we're going to get another wait-and-see period where if Grief is eliminated and the Psychic Frog decks still dominate, we are stuck with those for another couple of months until the next banning cycle runs around. And I find that kind of frustrating. And I want to take a look at some deck lists real quick. So I have just picked a Grixis Delver list at random here, or they are even just labeling it Grixis Frog because we know what the fuck is up. Grixis Delver is one of the other things that has been hanging in the metagame. Other than the frog here, everything else is kind of known and expected technology of what you would kind of be expecting to see from a Grixis Delver deck list. And this is a deck that, Grief gets banned day one. You can probably play this with minimal changes and do very, very well, because this was a powerful existing deck list. I think it's around 6% of the metagame right now or something like that. This is that same blue-black shell in a slightly different light. We don't have the Grief Reanimate portion here, but this is still probably going to be a little bit of an annoying deck list that is fueled by Psychic Frog. And again, Psychic Frog can be used to fuel these cards like DRC and Murktide Regent, getting the cards into the zone that you need them in. And Psychic Frog is going to dodge a lot of traditional red removal. And if you start playing things that specifically hit Psychic Frog, Abrupt Decay is something that gets thrown around a lot. It's just an uncounterable way to kill a Psychic Frog. Then that is going to miss other important things, such as the Murktide region. And I'm going to draw a little bit of an absurd comparison here, but I think you'll get the point. Psychic Frog might be the next in the line of pushed card advantage things that exist or not enough mana that ends up breaking the Daze Force of Will Brainstorm Ponder Shell. And over the past few years, we have seen a handful of cards that exist at 2 mana that draw a card in some capacity. Dreadhorde Arcanist let you flash back a spell specifically, and that was very targeted. This ability on average is much better than Psychic Frog's draw a card, but the general idea is clear. Before that, we saw things like Renin 6 that could plus to draw a card by recurring a land, and this one had other problems with pinging small creatures, but we got Bowmasters now, so we're used to 1 toughness creatures sucking. And if we go back even further than that, we can start thinking about things like Dig Through Time and Treasure Cruise that gave card advantage at 1 or 2 mana. There were some graveyard hoops to jump through, but every time these blue decks get the next busted source of card advantage, or that next card that is pushed a little bit too hard, something in them just kind of clicks. A handful of deck builders iterating heavily go through and they build something busted that takes over the metagame until we are either able to adapt or a banning is necessary. And this time around, I think we are very clearly in the, we have actively tried to adapt and failed portion of the metagame, where we are trying to adapt before MH3, we failed. We tried to adapt after MH3, we failed harder. Whoops. And let me be clear here, people are trying. So, person in the comment who is writing, these boomers are complaining without even trying, get good. No! The decks in the metagame have vastly adapted and changed. The current Eldrazi deck that is running around and doing somewhat well has been iterated on very quickly and is improving quickly, and we are seeing cards like Eldrazi Linebreaker break out and replace some of the old technology. You don't see nearly as many Reality Smashers running around anymore. That card might not be good enough anymore. I'm sorry, little buddy, I'm sorry. It's rough to say out loud. We have seen Stompy decks give up on Chalice of the Void because Chalice of the Void does not interact with Troll Animate Dead. It does not interact with Psychic Frog. The creatures of those Chalice decks often don't line up well against Psychic Frog either. We've seen those Chalice of the Void decks shift to things like Vexing Bauble or unlicensed Hearse in Game 1 to try to keep up with these blue-black decks. They're not doing it, even still. So with all that being said, what now? What do we do? Where do we go from here? And so in this next portion of the video, I want to talk about potential bannings other than grief, because I think that's kind of interesting and worthy of discussing. I see a lot of things thrown around, some of which I think are really good ideas, some of which I think are really bad ideas. And one of the things that I see shit-talked a lot is the card Reanimate. And I think what's important to keep in mind here is that historically, Reanimate is not a problematic card in Legacy, and frequently it's not even a very good card. Black-Red Reanimator had a heyday a few years back, ballpark 5 years ago now, with E.W. Landon championing the archetype and having a ton of success on Magic Online, especially in leagues. Outside of that specific player and a few people who, randomly will spike a challenge or something like that, a showcase event with Reanimator, the deck was not really a problem in any capacity until we started to get grief. And even the earlier builds of Reanimator that could be playing both grief and unmask for protection, those didn't end up being that good. It was ultimately this Rescaminator shell that came along and kind of changed the rules of engagement from a black red turbo reanimator deck list that did not have great plan Bs. Like if you stopped the reanimation angle, you stopped the deck. Changing that outlook from being an all in combo deck that was, generally speaking, affected by hate into a deck that is perfectly capable of playing a solid tempo game if the reanimator angle is shut off. That fundamental shift is what broke the deck. The reanimate itself has been fine in Legacy. I don't think that this is really a card that should have the word, like ban coming up in conversation around it. I think Reanimate is an awesome strategy. I love seeing Reanimator decks in Legacy. They're a fundamental part of the metagame. And if you kill the card Reanimate, you kind of kill a historical archetype. The 2-mana versions are a lot worse. Animate Dead is perfectly playable, but when you start going to the other ones beyond that, you start getting into cards that have real downsides. And the raw amount of text that exists on some of these other Animate Dead clones probably are an indication that they are not as good. They are just not quite as elegant. Maybe they only bring back legendary creatures. Maybe they bring back a non-legendary creature. Maybe they bring back the top card of your graveyard. You get the general idea. They're not as good. And so I would be very sad to see Reanimate go. And Reanimate being a busted thing in Legacy, a truly busted thing, that's new. So what about this guy? What about this guy? I am very torn about what I think about Psychic Frog in Legacy. I think it is a very interesting card. I think it is a very skill testing card. But I think it invalidates a bunch of things that should matter in Legacy. It invalidates combat math. It makes graveyard interaction significantly worse. It's a 2-mana threat. Yeah, threat's an okay word. It's a 2-mana threat that has card advantage and evasion baked into it, while also doing a bunch of things that overlap with relevant portions of the format. Pitching to Force of Will, pitching to Grief. Hopefully, it does not matter for very much longer. This is a card that I could see being banned in Legacy. And if Grief exits the format, leaving Psychic Frog, I think Psychic Frog becomes one of the better things to be doing in the format. And I am a little worried that Grief gets banned with no thought being given to Psychic Frog, and then we have this frog taking over Legacy and being the clear best thing to do when we should be exploring the impact of sets like Bloomburrow on Legacy. And then I feel like we're going to get trapped in this cycle of okay, Psychic Frog gets banned when Duskmourn, I think the name of the set that will follow Bloomburrow is, and then we can finally see what the Bloomburrow stuff is supposed to do, while we are also supposed to be exploring the stuff from Duskmourn. And I feel like leaving Psychic Frog in the format might end up being incredibly dangerous, but we have never seen what Psychic Frog looks like in the format without Grief also existing in the format. And these Grief decks put a very large amount of pressure on deck building, either actively or passively, in terms of your main deck and sideboard slots. And so, is Psychic Frog something that the format can adapt to if the Grief is not there taking out all of the interaction that could be taking out the Psychic Frog? I don't know. Feels like maybe. But if the answer is no, we can't adapt to it, I feel like we end up in another blue-black, maybe Grixis hell, just absolutely immediately. And if you take out Grief, you can still just play a tempo deck that has that Reanimator finish. You just don't also get Griefs to back it up. But you can still have Reanimate for Troll. You can still have Reanimate for Psychic Frog, Reanimate for Bowmaster, Reanimate for your opponent stuff that you are killing, as we have seen is perfectly relevant in things like Eldrazi Mirrors. So yeah. Could I, in good faith, pull the ban trigger on Psychic Frog? I don't know that I could. Am I very worried that this card is going to take over the format very, very heavily immediately after a grief ban? Yes. Yes, I am. Those are kind of my thoughts there. So the next thing here that I want to talk about is banning something that exists, generally speaking, within the blue cantrip shell. So it is no secret that some number of brainstorm, ponder, daze, force of will, based on metagame percentages, likely should be banned in Legacy. But their play patterns, generally speaking, are part of the format, and we enjoy those play patterns. Vintage is the format where you get one of everything if it's really, really broken, and Legacy is the format where for some reason we say it's okay to play brainstorms and ponders as four-ofs. Mom said it was okay, so we get to do it. And one of the things that comes up just about every time that something needs to be banned in Legacy is why don't we just go after the original Hydra head? Why don't we just weaken the core shell? And here's my answer to that. So this is an MTG Goldfish page that shows the top cards, top creatures, top lands, top spells in Legacy right now. And right now, when you look at this, this is just the blue-black Riskaminator deck, right? Top cards overall, the Riskaminator deck. Top creatures, the Riskaminator deck. Top spells, the Riskaminator deck. Top lands, the Riskaminator deck, and Forest managed to sneak in there at number 10. So right now, in this very warped metagame, the top cards in every category are just the best deck, because it has that degree of metagame saturation. But generally speaking, when you look at these lists in a healthy metagame, there is a mixture. And at any given time, you would be seeing some number of Ancient Tombs, Magus of the Moons, Goblin Rabble Masters. You are going to see portions of the Stompy shell or portions of the Control shell. Maybe something like Swords to Plowshares or, Lightning Bolts. You are going to see other bear cards, other things from other strategies in these top played lists. So when the format is not just busted in half, Legacy tends to have pretty damn good diversity. And while most of the time the best deck in Legacy tends to be a blue deck, that's not always the case. And over the past few years, we've seen times where fair decks like Death and Taxes were some of the better things to be doing in the format. We have seen multicolored blue control fueled by things like Up the Beanstalk. We have seen Delver decks. We have seen some combo decks really bust out on the scene, especially when some of the newer cards for the Storm Shell were printed, and things like Beseech the Mirror took the format by storm. Oh, see what I did there? Sorry, we're getting a little weird in the middle of this video. But I feel like we have had an interesting sort of cyclical metagame where people were figuring out how to attack things until we hit this most recent wall. And so while, yeah, the Daze, Ponder, Force of Will shell is very good, and we will continue to play whack-a-mole with things that end up being just a little bit too good in that blue shell, I think I am okay with playing that game of whack-a-mole. I think that's just part of Legacy. Legacy at any given time, is this far away from breaking, and we're usually on the right side of that line. Prior to this Riskaminator deck taking over the format, I found Legacy incredibly enjoyable and dynamic and skill testing, and now I'm wearing thin like butter spread over too much bread, if you catch my drift. So I don't think the general cantrip shell needs to be attacked. And I think within that general cantrip shell, there is a ton of room for fine-tuning and adjusting your deck list. And I want to keep Legacy's core identity in mind here. And let's go to Vintage for a minute. This is a fucked up Magic card, right? This is not okay as a Magic card. There are a few things in Vintage that exist like this, with maybe Mishra's Workshop and Bazaar of Baghdad being some of the best examples of just absolutely busted, fucked up cards that you're still allowed to play 4 copies of. And the metagame, generally speaking, from my understanding as an outsider, manages to more or less adjust to all of the broken things that you are allowed to do because everyone is coming to play with broken stuff. And there's some embarrassing, absolutely fucking embarrassing cards on the Vintage banned list in terms of power level because you want to keep the Mishra's Workshop legal because it is fun to do the broken things. And I think part of that is also part of the legacy experience where we enjoy this whole ponder, brainstorm, fetchland, mana base game. We feel like it is very skill testing. And I think objectively it is skill testing. And I think it, generally speaking, creates good games of Magic. When the blue pet layer can go, oh shit, I'm staring down a Murktide region. Oh, I drew a Ponder. Ponder, I now get 4 looks at my removal spell to keep the game going. I think that's okay. When the combo deck can dig for their combo pieces and try to combo off in the face of the Delver that is beating them to death, I think that's a good thing. I am generally speaking okay with the blue shell as it exists in Legacy. And I say that as someone who doesn't particularly enjoy cantrips myself. That's not my ideal way to play Legacy personally, but a lot of the things that I enjoy doing prey on people who are casting cantrips, so, I'm good with it. At a minimum here, there's one more card that I probably need to talk about in this section, and that's Orcish Bowmasters. So this is something that portions of the community have a very large divide on, very diverse opinions on. Generally speaking, from most of the very heavily involved, heavily invested legacy content creators, the opinion that I tend to hear from them is that Orcish Bowmasters isn't even that good. It is just a perfectly reasonable Magic card that you can play. Sort of at its peak, Orcish Bowmasters was maybe 40% of the format. As Psychic Frog came out and more people drifted further and further away from that, Bowmasters has dropped about 10%, maybe in about 30% of the decks now, often not in the main deck, but as a sideboard option. People cite this as something that produces warped play patterns. I would argue that it changed play patterns, but did not warp them in a negative way. I think the threat of having this to punish a brainstorm, which is a card that maybe should be banned in the format based on, how played it is. I think the ability to play things that punish cantrips hard, I think that is a good thing to have access to in the format. Most of the people that I hear complaining about this deck complain about the fact that this has wiped out small creature decks from the format, oftentimes citing things like combo elves, where they had small creatures and they also had card draw with things like Glimpse of Nature attached to them. And I think those people have a valid complaint, their deck did get wiped out essentially from the format by a single card. But of the hundreds upon hundreds of times that Orcish Bowmasters has been in play on my channel, how many times has it truly done the broken thing? How many brainstorms have I grabbed on this channel total with this? 5 or 6, maybe? How many times have I gotten, an Echo of Eons or another thing of that caliber? Certainly a few times, but I think the theoretical threat of this card is often greater than its actual impact on the gameplay. I think this is a great legacy card. I think this is a great legacy design. If the format goes to a different place, and someday this ends up being beyond the bounds of the format, that would not surprise me. I don't think we're there now. And I think this is just a perfectly fine tool to exist in Legacy. Is it sometimes a little frustrating? Yeah, absolutely. I don't think this one is bannable. If you ranked all of the cards in Legacy right now by how bannable they were, I don't even know that this would hit the top 10. Maybe it would, but this card seems so so utterly fair compared to other things that are happening in the format right now. Now, again, maybe this card is being held back right now by the blue-black deck, oddly enough. And once you take some cards out of that shell, like once the Griefs exit that shell, maybe Bowmaster comes back in. Bowmaster starts pinging the small creatures that come back, the Delvers, the DRCs, punishes cantrips, and maybe this ends up unhealthy. I don't think it is there right now. I guess one other thing that I should talk about while I'm here is that sometimes I hear a call for a ban of something like Necrodominance or Thassa's Oracle. I don't think that we have any sort of data that suggests that those cards are truly problematic. It's kind of bullshit that a Necrodominance deck can mull to 3 and just go Black Land, Swamp, Dark Ritual, and win from a mull to 3. Like, that is kind of a messed up thing to happen. Like, it is a very feel-bad thing. But I don't think there is any sort of data that really suggests that those things are a problem. Uh, let's put a number on it. Let's show you how bad this is. Let's go back to MTG Top 8 again. So when we are looking at a deck, a lot of times if something kind of hits the 5% or more range, it kind of is a real player, kind of in my opinion. That's when I start thinking like, oh, this is like something that I should really be aware of. And a lot of times when you start getting to like 6 or 7%, you're like, yeah, okay, that's a like seriously reasonable deck. And so like we see things like, you know, the Grixis Delver deck and the Eldrazi deck up here, and like that's perfectly reasonable. And as far as the control stuff, there's not a ton of it around that like exists in the exact same form, but some people are still like messing around with the beans. There's some Null Drifter Stifle Knot stuff running around. Like those are reasonable. Then there's that number. We're just gonna ignore that. We've already talked about that. But when we get to the combo, when we start looking for the Turbo Necrodominant stuff, that is not 2%. That is 0.2% of the metagame. That is beyond small. Like, that is the portion of the metagame that I would just kind of like fully ignore, not expecting that to show up in the average tournament. And Oops All Spells, despite, you know, having gotten a power up, also now is facing down cards like Vexing Bauble that are helping to keep it in check. And also, as of right now, you know, Grief, Force of Will, Force of Negation, Daze, Surgical Extractions, Ley Lines. There's a lot of stuff running around where this has taken a lot of collateral damage. But where things stand right now, I don't think any of those combo decks are unreasonable. I do wonder what Nadu decks start looking like in a world where some of the pressure is taken off of them. I think the Nadu decks are very good. I very frequently lose to them on camera, and I find them hard to sideboard against. But they're not a problem right now. Maybe they'll be a problem later. I don't know. The one other thing that I want to show you here that is really an indicator that something is fucked up with this metagame is some of the numbers for decks that were incredibly popular. So Initiative Stompy, a while back, was one of the best decks in the format. You know, literally got cards banned from it and was still perfectly reasonable in a post-banning world. Now it's hardly playable. The builds just can't hang with the blue-black deck. Decks that just have a large amount of creatures and a large amount of evasion are a problem because they can take the initiative back. And Grief, target you, reanimate your initiative creature is some shit. Let me tell you, when you get your initiative creature reanimated on turn 1 and you are behind after losing your best card from your hand, it's pretty rough. And similarly, numbers for other fair decks like Moon Stompy and Death and Taxes have like certainly plummeted as well. Generally speaking, we expect a control deck to have a relatively large share of the metagame, but like, how are you building your control deck to beat the blue-black deck that nobody has really figured out how to beat? See the problem? Like, you can't control the best thing, so why try? You just submit this deck instead. All right, so let's go ahead and wrap this thing up. I have no idea for how long I've been talking now, but it feels like this is video-sized at this point. So if you've been wondering why I have been frustrated with the blue-black shell recently, and why I am complaining when I see the Griefs and Psychic Frogs in play now, it's because I'm sick of them. Like, they are too good for the bounds of the format, And on this channel, which is not trying to optimize for tournament play, but is trying to like show off cool brews, getting repeatedly smacked around by the best deck in the format that is hard to attack, it's gotten a little bit old. I am ready for a change, and I am tired of exploring these cool Modern Horizons 3 cards through the lens of this Grief metagame, which is highly warped. I want to know how busted this Eldrazi deck is, you know? Is this truly the future of what this Eldrazi deck looks like? You know, is this a viable metagame piece? And this, like, basically true aggro deck exists without the Chalice of the Voids that have been backing it up versus combo for years. How viable are these larger Cloud Post deck lists? How good is Sowing Mycos Spawn? Where does this Nadu deck really fall in the grand scheme of Legacy? Like, I have so many questions that I would love to answer about the metagame, but I don't really get to answer those right now. And I am hopeful for the future of Legacy, and I'm hoping that we don't go from a lame duck period immediately into another lame duck period, and Psychic Frog just takes over the format. I'm very much hoping that isn't the case, but we'll see, right? If you enjoyed everything that was going on today in this video, please consider checking out my podcast, the Eternal Glory Podcast. We do episodes like this every other week, and you get more voices than just my own to weigh in on the issue, and that's always wonderful. If you have your own comments, feel free to throw them down below. Very open to some reasonable discussion here. If you think something else is kind of fucked in the Legacy format and you want to talk about that, throw it down into the comments below. And folks, I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day, and we'll do the best that we can for this next month, and I will do my best to, put on a smile and record the videos without getting burnt out. But it's a little tough right now. We're not quite in like Oko nothing I do matters mode, but we're a step or two away from that. All right. See ya.